In the year 1637, a man in Holland traded his entire family farm for a single flower bulb. He truly believed he was about to become the richest man in the world. But within a few days, that bulb was worth no more than a common onion. This is not just an old story from a history book. It is a mirror held up to our modern souls. I remember my grandfather telling me that the earth never rushes to grow a tree. He was a simple man, but he understood the rhythm of life. Today I look at the digital screens flashing with fast money, and I feel a deep worry. We have forgotten the lesson of the tree. We have become obsessed with the speed of the harvest rather than the health of the soil. This is the great illusion of our modern age. Everyone is searching for a shortcut. We see teenagers becoming millionaires overnight on social media. We hear about moonshots that promise to change your life in a week. This is our current situation. We live in a culture of extreme velocity. We are told that if we aren't moving fast, we are failing. We treat our wealth like a race. We are all sprinting toward a finish line that keeps moving. But history tells a very different story. It is a story that repeats itself like the seasons. Whenever we try to outrun time, we fall. The complication is that human nature hasn't changed in 400 years. Whether it is tulips or modern digital bubbles, the pattern is the same. Fast money is like a flash flood. It looks powerful and exciting for a moment, but it has no roots in the ground. It washes away as quickly as it arrives. It leaves behind nothing but mud and debris. Slow money, on the other hand, is like a deep flowing river. This leads us to a vital question. Why are we so afraid of the slow path? Why do we feel ashamed of steady, quiet growth? In our faith, we are taught that baraka is found in patience. Yet we let the noise of the markets drown out this wisdom. We are trading our blessing for velocity. We are trading our long-term resilience for a short-term hit. We need to ask if the fast path is even leading us home. I spent 36 years in the corporate world. I watched the rise and fall of many famous leaders. I saw those who chased the quarterly bonus. Often those people are now forgotten or broken. The ones who survived are different. They are the ones who are still smiling at my age. They understood the ascent of money. They knew that wealth is not a sprint. It is a slow, methodical climb. It requires the right equipment and a lot of heart. True wealth is invisible to the eye. It is the peace of knowing you don't owe anyone your soul. When you chase fast money, you are borrowing from your future. You are taking on risks that you do not understand. You are building your house on sand. You didn't want to take the time to dig into the rock. History is a graveyard of empires built on fast money. If we want to survive, we must learn to love the slow rhythm. We must respect the time it takes for things to grow. The global world will always offer you a faster way. It will promise you that you can skip the hard work. But the laws of history do not care about our technology. They only care about our character. Slow money builds character. Fast money reveals our flaws. We must choose which path we want to walk. My grandfather didn't have a computer, but he had a compass that never failed him. He knew that if you walk slowly in the right direction, you arrive. If you run fast in the wrong direction, you are lost. Today I want to help you find your compass. I want us to look at the ghosts of the past. I want us to learn from their mistakes so we don't repeat them. Wealth is a journey of 1,000 miles. You cannot finish it in a single day. You must be willing to take the first step. And then the second step. You must be willing to keep walking when others are running. The person who runs will tire out. The person who walks will reach the mountain. Slow money is not about being lazy. It is about being intentional. It is about knowing that every cent has a story. It is about respecting the labor of your hands. When you earn money slowly, you appreciate it more. You don't throw it away on things that don't matter. History shows us that the tortoise always wins, not because he is faster, but because he never stops. He doesn't get distracted by shiny things. He knows his destination. He trusts his feet. We must be like that tortoise. We must be the ones who stay on the path. When I look at the map of the world today, I see a lesson. I see countries that were built over many centuries. The most stable nations are not those that found a gold mine. They are those that built laws and trust over time. This is the information the fast money crowd ignores. Wealth is not just about the coins in your pocket. It is about the trust you have built. Think about the Great Depression of 1929. The world was high on the roaring 20s. People were buying stocks with borrowed money. They thought the party would never end. But the complication was that the wealth was a ghost. It had no foundation in the real world. When the crash came, it lasted for a decade. It led to the darkest days of human history. Fast money creates a fragile world. It creates a world where everything can disappear in a night. We are living through a similar era today. We see companies that have never made a profit, yet they are worth billions of dollars. We see digital assets that jump up and down like a ball. The fast money siren is singing to us. She is telling us to jump into the water. As someone who has seen the cycles of the 90s, I am worried. I saw the crash of 2008 up close. I am telling you to stay on the boat. The water is full of rocks that you cannot see. The question we should ask is, what are we trying to achieve? If you want to buy a luxury car today, then fast money is your hope. But if you want to provide for your grandchildren, it is a trap. If you want to live with dignity in your old age, you need slow money. We must realign our habits with our deepest values. We must stop being consumers and start being ancestors. The answer lies in how we behave. Doing well with money is not about being a genius. It is about having the heart to wait. Slow money requires the behavior of a gardener. It requires you to plant seeds when it is cold. It requires you to pull weeds when no one is looking. It requires the discipline to not eat your seeds. This is the brutal truth of wealth. Compounding is the eighth wonder of the world. But compounding is a very shy creature. It only shows up if you stay in the room. If you leave to chase a new thing, it vanishes. In my years at the work, I managed many large projects. The ones that failed were the ones where we cut corners. The ones that succeeded were the ones where we respected the process. History's greatest fortunes weren't built in a week. They were built through survival. Look at the merchant families of the Silk Road. They didn't build their wealth in one generation. They built it over hundreds of years. They prioritized survival over speed. They knew that staying in the game is the most important part. Fast money is a strategy for those who are desperate. Slow money is a strategy for those who are determined. I often reflect on the concept of risk or provision. We believe that what is meant for us will never miss us. This belief should give us a sense of calm. If we truly believe our provision is written, why the rush? Why are we so anxious that we make foolish choices? Slow money is a form of spiritual discipline. It is a way of saying, I trust the provider. It is a way of honoring the time we have been given. We don't need to steal from tomorrow to pay for today. The ascent of money is a long ladder. If you try to jump to the top, you will fall. If you take one step at a time, you will get there. And when you get there, you will have the strength to stay there. People who get rich fast often lose it just as fast. Their muscles are not strong enough to hold the weight. Slow money builds the strength you need to carry your success. I have seen men lose everything because they couldn't wait. They wanted the prize without the struggle. They forgot that the struggle is what makes the prize valuable. When you work for $1, that dollar has a soul. When you gamble for $1, it is just paper. History is full of paper millionaires, but the world is built by the people of the soul. Think about the traditional houses in our villages. They were built to last for generations. They used the best wood. They took a long time to finish, but they are still standing today. Wealth is the same way. Do you want a house that stands or a house that cracks? The resolution to our modern anxiety is to slow down. We must reject the fast money narrative. We must embrace what I call financial anti-fragility. The benefit is a life that is not just wealthy, but blessed. When you move slowly, you have time to see clearly. You see the risks before they hit you. You have a margin of safety. You can sleep through a market crash. You become the person that the system cannot break. To build this fortress, we must follow new rules. First, we must choose ownership over leverage. Debt is the most common reason for the fall of empires. Fast money loves debt because it is like fuel, but fuel can also start a fire. Slow money is built on what you actually own. It might look smaller, but it is real. No bank can take away a debt-free life. Second, we must treat patience as an asset. In the world today, patience is very scarce. Most people cannot wait 10 minutes for a meal. If you can wait 10 years for an investment, you have a superpower. You have an advantage over nearly everyone else. While others are panicking, you are calm. Third, we must focus on real value. History shows that things with true value always survive. Land, skills, food, and strong relationships are real. Fast money is often tied to illusions. It is tied to things on a screen. Slow money is tied to things that matter to the heart. Invest in your mind and motion. Invest in the education of your children. These are the assets that inflation cannot touch. The action you need to take today is an audit. Look at your velocity. Are you moving so fast that you are missing the signs? If your wealth disappeared tomorrow, could you rebuild it? If not, you are relying on luck. It is time to start digging the foundations of your slow money fortress. Start small, but start today with a pure intention. I want you to imagine yourself at my age. You are 61 years old. You are sitting on your porch. You are looking at a garden that you tended for decades. Your children are successful. Your debts are zero. Your heart is at peace. You look back and you smile. You didn't let the bubbles tempt you. You stayed on the path. You honored the time. That feeling of peace is the true reward. The global world will continue to be chaotic. International relations will shift. New get-rich technologies will emerge every single year. But the laws of history are as fixed as the stars. He who gathers little by little makes it grow. This is a truth found in our scriptures. It is found in the ledgers of the world's most successful families. Don't let the flashing lights fool you. The brightest lights often burn out the fastest. The slow, steady glow of the lantern is what leads you home. Your life journey does not need a miracle. It only needs a decision. It is the decision to stop sprinting and start walking. It is the decision to value your time more than your status. It is the decision to be the gardener of your own future. Thank you for walking with me today. We have looked at the pages of our shared history. Keep your mind in motion, but keep your heart in the long game. The race is not to the swift, but to those who keep moving. I wish you peace on this journey. I wish you wisdom in your choices. I wish you the courage to be slow in a world that is running. The path is long, but the destination is beautiful. Do not be afraid of the time it takes. The best things in life always take time. Your wealth will grow as you grow. Your peace will deepen as your roots go down. This is the promise of slow money. Take a deep breath. Look at your hands. They are the tools for your future. Use them wisely. Use them to build something that lasts. Don't chase the wind. Plant the tree. One day you will sit in its shade, and you will be glad that you didn't rush. You will be glad that you chose the slow path. The slow path is the only one that leads to true freedom. May your path be filled with blessings. May your hands be strong and your heart be calm. Be the person who built a fortress of peace. I will be here, walking beside you. We will learn together.